Ever heard of the Napoleon complex? You know, the idea that short guys overcompensate by being extra aggressive and maybe trying to conquer Europe. Pop culture paints Napoleon Bonaparte as history's ultimate tiny, angry toddler in an oversized hat. But here's the most explosive plot twist of the 19th century. He wasn't short at all. Let's look at the cold, hard facts from his actual autopsy and official imperial records. Napoleon measured exactly 168 centimeters. Now, you might think, wait, 168? That's roughly 5'6". Isn't that still kind of short? Today, maybe a little. In the year 1800, absolutely not. The average French peasant at the time was running on stale bread and muddy water, meaning the average male height in France was only about 160 to 165 centimeters, which means Napoleon wasn't just average. He was technically taller than most of his subjects. For the early 1800s, he was practically a tall, dark, and handsome Chad. So how did the whole world get tricked into thinking he was a literal dwarf? Time to do some math. When Napoleon died, the official French medical report recorded his height as exactly 5 feet 2 inches. Hearing 5'2", the British immediately spat out their tea and rejoiced. In British measurements, that meant the terrifying Emperor of France was the size of a 12-year-old schoolboy. But there was one massive, nation-sized problem with this math. A French inch, known as a pouce, was completely different from an English inch. France used an older measurement system tied to the king's foot, which was, apparently, massive. 1 French inch equaled roughly 2.7 centimeters. Meanwhile, the puny English inch was only 2.54 centimeters. It sounds like a tiny difference, but multiply that mistake across 62 inches, and a French 5'2" magically transforms into a British 5'6". That is almost 10 centimeters of height lost entirely to a bad translation. Did the British press realize their mistake? Probably. Did they care? Absolutely not. It was the perfect propaganda weapon to humiliate their greatest enemy. But bad math was only half the problem. Napoleon was actually sabotaging himself. If you want to look tall, rule number 1 is never hang out with giants. Napoleon completely ignored this rule. He constantly surrounded himself with the Imperial Guard, his elite personal bodyguards. To join this elite squad, you had to pass a strict height requirement of 178 to 185 centimeters. Remember, the average guy walking the streets back then was barely clearing 160. So imagine Napoleon, a perfectly normal 168 centimeter guy, taking a stroll. Now imagine him flanked by a moving wall of absolute units standing over 6 feet tall. And it gets worse. The Imperial Guard wore massive bearskin caps. These ridiculous fuzzy towers added an insane amount of extra height, turning tall soldiers into walking skyscrapers. Standing next to them, Napoleon basically looked like he was on a middle school field trip. Every time he appeared in public, painters and crowds fell for an extreme optical illusion. The public didn't think, wow, those bodyguards are incredibly huge. They just thought, man, the Emperor of France is incredibly tiny. This visual disaster was terrible for his PR. But his own soldiers were about to make it worse. The French army absolutely loved Napoleon, and they had a very specific nickname for him. They called him Le Petit Caporal, which translates directly to the Little Corporal. Naturally, British spies heard this and instantly assumed the emperor was physically bite-sized. But in French military slang, petite had absolutely nothing to do with height. It was actually an affectionate term of endearment, a sign of deep respect from the troops. In modern terms, they weren't calling him a dwarf, they were calling him our guy, or bro. He earned it because he actually got down in the mud to aim the cannons alongside regular soldiers. To his men, he was a fearless, down-to-earth commander. To the British translators reading intercepted letters, he was just a literal smurf. It was the ultimate dictionary fail, destroying his historical reputation for centuries. The French troops would be absolutely horrified to know their wholesome nickname became an eternal insult. But once the British press got their hands on this literal translation, the myth of the microscopic, angry French leader was locked in stone forever. And it was about to be turned into a viral meme by history's greatest 19th century troll.
Meet James Gilray, a British caricaturist who was basically the ultimate meme lord of the 1800s. His job was to make the British public laugh at the most dangerous military commander on Earth. Armed with the fake British height math and the literal translation of Little Corporal, Gilray started drawing Napoleon as an absolutely microscopic, furious infant throwing temper tantrums. He dubbed this ridiculous character Little Boney, and the British public completely lost their minds. These prints went insanely viral, hanging in every pub, shop window, and coffee house in London. It didn't matter that Napoleon was actually out there defeating massive European armies in real life, because on paper, he was just a pathetic little gremlin in oversized boots, crying about his lost ships. This was weapons-grade psychological warfare, designed to strip away his terrifying aura.
And it worked so perfectly that even other European nations started copying Gilray's tiny Napoleon memes. Legend has it, Napoleon hated Gilray's drawings more than he hated actual British cannons. Gilray single-handedly rewrote history using nothing but paper, ink, and peak British sarcasm. The man died, but the caricature survived for over 200 years. Which brings us to the ultimate insult, a psychological disorder named after a math mistake.
So how did a bad translation, tall bodyguards, and a satirical artist turn into a 20th century psychological term? Psychologists in the 1900s officially coined the phrase Napoleon complex to describe aggressive short men. The best part? Napoleon himself had absolute zero psychological link to this syndrome. He was well-educated, emotionally secure, and completely fine with his perfectly average height. Yet 200 years later, we still use a French emperor as a punchline for being vertically challenged. History didn't write the story of Napoleon's height. British propaganda did. Verdict: myth utterly destroyed. Napoleon was average height, but British trolls were elite tier. Tomorrow, did ancient Romans actually spend their whole lives sweating in uncomfortable bedsheet togas? Subscribe to live it.